Welcome back. Now, as we've been hearing all morning, the challenges posed by 2020 have been extraordinary for this industry and, of course, for this event itself, Empower having to adapt to this virtual world. So who better to ask to moderate this next panel discussing how the wealth management industry have risen to those challenges than the Empower Global Executive Producer herself, Jenny Adams. Jenny, it's over to you and your esteemed panel.
Emma, lovely to see you as ever. Thank you very much. Well, what a panel we have for you for this fantastic session. We've got top asset managers, a leading service provider, and one of the industry's top thought leaders. So I'd like to introduce the panel. We have got Saka Nusseibeh, CBE, CEO, International Federated Hermes. We've got Jean Raby, CEO of Natixis Investment Managers and head of Natixis Asset and Wealth Manager. We've got Gary Baker, CFA, Managing Director EMEA of the CFA Institute. And we've got Patrick Colle, CEO of BNP Paribas Securities Services. Now we're going to kick off this session with scene setting from Gary Baker from the CFA Institute. He's going to give us an overview of the state of the industry. Gary.
Thank you, Jenny, and welcome everyone. I'd like to do this in two parts, just very briefly. One is to set the scene in terms of the background to how we arrive at some of these conclusions that I'm going to present. And then secondly, to talk about and present three challenges that then we're going to discuss as part of the panel arrangement. This work is really based on research we've conducted for the last 4 years, and that's been all about surveying both our members, but also the industry more widely, asset managers, asset owners, participants. And we produced 3 pieces of research talking about future state of the investment profession, the investment firm of the future, and most recently, the investment professional of the future. And really what we're trying to do is various stages. It's to give people on this call, people in the industry generally, a roadmap to try and navigate some of the challenges and changes facing everyone. And that really goes in 3 parts. First of all, it's acknowledging the mega trends, as we call them, the big, slow-moving trends, demographics, government, regulation, resource management, that really are facing all of us in terms of how we plot, navigate the future. Secondly, it's then introducing the forces that are more specific to finance, the challenges, the passive active, technology, fee compression, all the things that you know very well and are well aware of. And with a combination of those 2 things, we try and set 4 scenarios. Now, these aren't predictions, these are scenarios in which to take and try and introduce and combine and navigate your own strategy with. And that is all around fintech disruption, obvious what that talks to, something we call parallel worlds, which is recognition that there is no single audience. It's a multitude, an atomization, if you will, of the investing public, of the institutional markets as well, whether by geography or by risk tolerance, etc. Lower for longer, that's the reality of the markets that we're facing now. How do we generate value within a lower for longer scenario? And then finally, it's purposeful capitalism, which is obviously all about this rise of broader aspects, sustainability, but also belief and interest in terms of something other than perhaps just pure financial returns. And so with that, that really set the scene for the industry of the future. What we then generate for the firm of the future was to, how do you take those down and be clear as to what your model is that you're trying to operate with? And you've got various choices there. Is it people driven? Is it organizational driven? Is it product driven? But what you have to be, any firm involved in that industry has to understand where it is and where it is trying to get to. So purposeful in decision making and very authentic in terms of what you're then carrying through and trying to do with it. And then the final part of the jigsaw was how this relates to individuals. Clearly, CFA Institute is a member organization. We want to speak to those individuals within the industry as well. And that is all about this commitment to lifelong learning. It's a commitment to engagement, both within the firm you're involved with, but also within that wider industry. And how do you go about that process? It's that combination of technology and human aspects that we're all going to have to perfect now and going forwards if we want to have successful business models. So that leads me on to my final point, which is presenting 3 scenarios that I think are some of the biggest challenges. I'm not saying they're the only challenges, but 3 of the biggest challenges that I think we're all facing, whether asset owners, asset managers, service providers within the industry. First of all, it's how do I reallocate resources towards innovative products while choosing which legacy products to defend? This classic case of how do I innovate, still looking after my cash cows, but accepting that I've got to innovate and I can't just rely on this annuity income from products that are in decline. So how do you get that balance right? Huge challenge on the product side. Secondly, on the people side, it's how do I retool my workforce for that future investment management? Clearly, we very few of us start with blank pieces of paper here. So it's how do we commit to our workforce to attract, retrain, educate, going forwards, to keep them secure within the culture of the business that you're trying to develop and protect. And then finally, and a more specific one, I think, was on ESG. Clearly, ESG already has been a very big subject of the conference so far, and many other panels, I'm sure, to come in the next few days. But how do I avoid being lost within the ESG crowd, particularly where my firm's efforts are not necessarily most recent? Maybe I've got a long history of involvement, but that is now being lost because obviously the industry has pivoted to ESG so quickly. And that speaks to this swarming instinct of the industry, very, very quick and fast trend followers. And that's what we're seeing with ESG. So how do you stand out within that ESG march in terms of differentiating your product set? So those are, I think, 3 of the big challenges for firms out there. As I said, that is based on the research that we've done. All that research is available on the CFA Institute website. I really would encourage you to try and look at that to inform and influence and take on board within your own strategic purpose. So with that, let me hand back to Jenny. Jenny, you're on mute.
Gary, thank you so much. That was great. So I'd like to turn to Saka now for his response about what Federated Hermes are doing in practice around what they see as the key challenges to address in this current era.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. And thank you, Gary, for an excellent presentation and megatrends, challenge to finance, purposeful capitalism. And then, of course, you talked about the swarming effect. And let me start off the bat. Given our position in ESG going back 30 odd years, we welcome the swarming effect. Why? Because we think that finance has a purpose, and that goes back to purposeful capitalism, and that what finance probably is doing now is finding its correct purpose, and I'd argue, in fact, finding its position as a long-term player, and therefore going back to purposeful capitalism, and I want to come back to that. I think for us to be able to present, for finance to do its right job, if you like, then there are several things that need to happen across the industry. Things need to change for governments and for corporations and for the financial services. Investment houses need to change. We need to think about the way our industry is set up and what the vested interests are, and then think about what our role can be in meeting major challenges like climate change. So let me start off. What is the issue that's changed here? Why is ESG suddenly becoming so important? I'd argue it's because we're beginning to discover the long term. If you really think very carefully about it, ESG is simply a way of thinking about the long term as opposed to the short term. What are the challenges? The entirety of society is locked into a short-term cycle. In developed countries, we have governments that are locked in 4 or 5 year cycles. So actually, they don't think more than 3, if you think about it. Corporations are locked into short-term cycle because they report to the market. Even asset managers are locked in short-term cycle, open up any presentation of any performance for fund managers and asset managers. You will see it goes 3 and then possibly 1 and then quarter. Nobody says to you 10, 15 years. And yet the challenges that were shown by COVID tells you that in fact the long-term challenges are the ones that really make a difference. And these are the ones we have to meet if A, we're going to generate sustainable long-term wealth, and B, if we're really going to make sure that we mitigate long-term risk. So what do we as an asset management house need to do to change? I don't think it's just about product. We can always find the right product. We're good at this. I don't think it's necessarily even finding, and that's just simply the wrapper. I think it's a change in mentality in thinking about accumulating wealth correctly over the very long term and understanding that to do so, we have to invest in a system that in fact benefits all the stakeholders in the ecosystem. Why? Because we're all participants in it. The shareholders of companies are not separate from the society in which companies operate. Typically, the shareholders of the companies, whether through pension funds or individual savings, are the same people who are also the people who work in these companies, who are employed by these companies, who service these companies. And therefore, asset management houses have got to understand that in serving companies, they mustn't isolate share price movements away from, if you like, just the one aspect. And by doing that, they ensure that you have sustainability. And COVID has shown how, for example, the thing that we've been talking about for some time, which is culture, suddenly becomes very, very important in which companies do better and which companies do worse. So I think that is an important one. The challenge what's the challenge? Why isn't industry going so quickly forward to that and adopting it? Apologize about that background noise. That's my machine turning off. The reason is, I think, not that there's vested interest or people are evil. It's just people haven't thought about it this way. We're an industry that's been built over the last however many years to think simply in terms of very short-term time slots. And we've been asked suddenly by society to consider 10, 15-year time slots. And we're not entirely sure how to cope with it. And I think that's the issue. And then we somehow have come to believe that purposeful capitalism is something new. And therefore, almost we're approaching it with care so as not to trip up on what proper capitalism should be. And I'm looking something up that I wanted to read to the audience and to you. There is an assumption that there is the free market economics that we all understand, and there is the new woke capitalism, let's call it, as people talk about it. But our free market economic understanding is based on Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, in fact, was not writing primarily about markets when he did. He was writing about moral philosophy. And I want to quote from his book on the theory of moral sentiments, which actually precedes his book on markets. And he talks about the rational person. I apologize, he uses the masculine. This is, of course, 1770 when sexism was rife, but please accept it as being for both genders, but I'll use his exact words. He, meaning the rational person, is sensible too that his own interest is connected with the prosperity of society. His own interest is connected with the prosperity of society. And that the happiness, perhaps the preservation of his existence, happiness means actually well-being. This whole thing about GDP being measured by well-being, Adam Smith worked it out long before. Happiness, perhaps the preservation of his existence. Preservation of his existence depends upon its preservation. What is its? The prosperity of society. So purposeful capitalism was seen by Adam Smith as a prerequisite for a successful free market economy. And just think about that. And so in a sense, the challenge for the asset management industry is to go back to a proper understanding of Adam Smith and apply long-term metrics and understand the long-term issues. And I will end because my time slot is almost up. The perfect issue that we can think about is climate change. Climate change is going to hit everybody that is concerned within the financial system. It hits the savers because it's going to change the environment in which they're going to retire. There's an intergenerational thing. It hits people who are under 30 much worse than it hits the older ones. It's going to hit society as a whole, and it's going to change us as a company and everybody else around us. And yet, it's a challenge the effects of which are not going to become apparent for a long time. So how do we get round to thinking about this? And COVID should have given us an understanding that when these things happen out of left field, they can substantially change the way that our society can work and substantially weaken it. And therefore, the mitigation of this risk is not a theoretical mitigation. Had we thought more about pandemics, which we should have, we might have mitigated a massive cut to GDP that's going to affect thousands, hundreds of thousands of employers, employees, savers, and citizens. And so we should think about the long term. And that then comes down to the final point. This is an issue of simply talking and education. So we have to educate society, we have to educate each other, we have to educate ourselves. I hand back to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Saka. Now, Jean, what is your perspective of the key challenges? You too at Natixis are very embedded in addressing climate change. So it'd be interesting to have your perspective on Saka's take.
I'm happy to do that, but and perhaps structure my comments along the three challenges that Gary put forward. But I'd like to come back on something Saka said and to be quite pragmatic about it or illustrative. It's the long term, the necessity of taking a much more long-term approach to investing in financial markets. And I think that's a function of, yes, indeed, when we think about the issues that are now prevalent in everybody's minds, and that's summarized by ESG, they're long-term in the making, they'll be long-term in the resolving. And secondly, as you think about the post-COVID world, I think everyone wants to contribute to the recovery. The recovery will be long. We have done some significant drastic changes to our economic footprint. Of course, governments have been there to alleviate some of that, but there'll be some long-term consequences. And as we think about encouraging long-termism in the financial markets, I'd like to put forward two ideas that are not often enough mentioned. One, from the point of view of corporates, are we sending the right signal when we ask for quarterly reporting? I've been in a management team. I can tell you the tyranny of the quarter is really that. It forces you to think too short-term as a management. Secondly, the flip side of that is having as a mantra daily liquidity in mutual funds. Now, of course, that's for largely retail investors for their protection. But you could take a different view in that we should be less focused on daily liquidity, because at the end of the day, if you want to encourage long-termism in the financial markets, it's across the spectrum. As Gary said, it's very fragmented. But if we're at least the direction of travel is consistent with one another, I think we can over time change financial markets. In terms of how we're addressing the challenges of that Gary highlighted, and notably ESG and how to stand out, I'll be brief. Our approach is multi-boutique. Of course, there's a cacophony of voices right now. Let's recognize it. And many people say that in response to that cacophony, we need standards. Frankly, from our perspective, we're trying to be diverse by design. Many of these issues are subjective. They depend on various ways of looking at life, morality, and perhaps climate change is science-driven. But the other aspects of ESG, and some of them even within E, need to be in the gray zone. And excellence is in the finding the right shades of gray. It's rarely black or white. And for example, when you think about climate change, accompanying companies who are transitioning is probably, in our view, more effective than excluding full stop. So as I think about being diverse by design, this is how we're trying to differentiate ourselves in the ESG space. And I know time is limited, so I'll leave it at that with perhaps one footnote. I think it's important for, as an industry, we are trying to engineer, as an asset manager, we're trying to engineer a common response. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. Why? Because we do not have a tradition of working with each other. Banks work with each other. They trade with each other. Asset managers do not have that. I call on my colleagues to try to collaborate more in partnership to advance some of these issues.
Thank you, Jean. That was really fascinating. Now we've got one service provider on the panel, Patrick Colle, taking a different perspective from the infrastructure side. Patrick, what's your view of the challenges that we face and your role coming from the service provider and fund administration sector about how we can improve things.
Thank you, Jenny, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, as a service provider, asset services, so we, on one hand, we support the same challenges as mentioned by Saker and Jean, but in a way, I would also introduce probably a fourth challenge that we collectively, asset managers and asset services, have to grapple with. And that is really, how do we reconcile the increasing need to extract cost efficiencies on one side and the need to invest for growth? And probably in terms of asset management, it's investing for market share growth because the size of the pool is not growing much anymore. And basically, it's how do we address a series of dilemmas, basically? I mean, how to rationalize fund ranges while at the same time covering new markets, new solutions, ESG solutions. How do we reduce cost while at the same time adapting to ever changing and increasing regulations? So this is what I see as the big fourth challenge, I would say, where both asset services and asset managers, I believe, are united in terms of finding a solution. What we do on our side, I mean, very high level, I would say, especially on a post-COVID sort of context, and leveraging very much on some of the good practices that were evidenced during COVID, is very much accelerating the deployment of digital for maximizing automation. But also it's a realization that in these times, partnering is key to be relevant and yet profitable for the long run. Partnerships make more and more sense. It is the way to extend capabilities, whatever they are, at an affordable price. And frankly, in that world, we need to be joined at the hip together. Partnerships make sense. And we are accelerating a series of partnerships, be it in the digital space, in the distribution space, private capital capabilities, you name it. We'll probably come back to that. I don't want to be too long, but that's in a nutshell the fourth challenge and kind of highlights as to how we respond to it.
Thank you, Patrick. So we've got about 8 minutes left. So I thought we've got time for kind of 2 or 3 questions. So carrying on from your comments, Patrick, about how we're going to address the cost problem of the asset management industry to enable us to be an industry that's purposeful and achieve the outcomes that both Saker and Jean have mentioned. I'd like to ask Saker first, how at Hermes do you think you're going to solve the cost problem? Is it through outsourcing, digitalization, or more consolidation? Just a very, very brief response.
Very briefly, we have been moving to a single platform a while back, so we have a very simplicity in design, and we did that on purpose. We partner with our service providers, so very much what Patrick says, we take very much that attitude. I'm talking about the international business, our business in London. And the third one is we built it on low margins. I mean, understand that the asset management business works on very high margin. We designed ours to be successful at lower normalized margins rather than the high margins that the others would do. That includes some digitalization, that includes some outsourcing, but it's a mentality.
Great, thank you. Jean, what's your view of how to make your business so efficient that you can achieve your objectives that you set out earlier?
Well, my comments would be quite peculiar because, as you know or may know, we have a multi-boutique model, probably on a scale that is not existing anywhere else, given that we have a multi-boutique model, both in the US and in Europe. It makes for 24 different investment companies, which are all autonomous and entrepreneur and have their own brand. We believe that's the recipe for success in generating alpha over the long term. On the other hand, it does create a duplication of cost. We are aware of that. And our approach now is trying to find areas where we can, by keeping the client at the center of our efforts and by keeping the management teams very engaged in their own business, find a way to mutualize or get our affiliates to work more together. And that's in terms of mutualization of cost. That's also in terms of launching new initiatives that I would consider as innovative approach from our perspective, where we put 1, 2, or 3 affiliates together to actually put forward a proposition, a solution to clients. These are the 2 things we're trying to do. It's not easy because it's the flip side of the strength of our model. But we're focusing on that in part because, as you said, the industry needs to be more efficient.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Gary, what's the CFA's institute and conclusions of research into this this 4th challenge?
Well, I think it's been illustrated by the responses so far that there's not one size fits all here. You know, whether that's a single platform or diverse by design. I like that phrase. It's and I think the importance is demonstration of value. Understand the purpose, set out purpose, and then be clear how you're demonstrating value. It's not just cost, it's the complete equation of this is why it costs what it costs, is because of the value that we're bringing to it. And I think if there's clarity on demonstration of value, then cost can be included and subsumed within that, but it can't just be about cost.
Sure. Okay, I would like now to go to Saka, and I'm very interested if he had one single piece of advice to other industry CEOs to keep their businesses relevant and profitable. What would you say?
I would say we need to change, and this is advice to myself before everybody else, we need to change our perspective to think of ourselves less, being less about trying to beat a benchmark or make absolute amounts of money in a particular time, and think much more of ourselves as stewards of the capital that we invest and stewards of the businesses that we invest in for the investors in society over the long term. So it's a mental change.
A mental change.
I'm going to quote Bob Marley, from mental slavery. Anyway.
Jean, what's your single pearl of wisdom?
Oh my God, I would not qualify my comments as wisdom, but I have to say something that is commonplace, but I would say even more important today, which is to be very focused and spend probably more management time than we have the inclination to do on talent management and diversity and inclusion topics. I think it's very relevant for the future of our industry. And we, although we talk about it, I'm sure we can actually do more. And I think it's prevalent across the industry.
Interesting. Very, very topical. And Patrick, your piece of advice for other CEOs.
I basically said it and I will repeat it. It's really the power of partnerships, and it's partnering with clients, but it's also partnering with your partner providers in a way to accelerate your either automation, digitization, or your product capabilities extension, or whatever. It is really the best one from my perspective.
And Gary, can you sum up all your research? What do you think is the secret sauce for the most successful CEO of the future? What would you advise them that they had to do first thing on Monday morning to be relevant and profitable?
I'll be a bit provocative, and I'll just say lead. The key thing that our research screams out as people in firms want to see is their CEOs lead. Be brave, be inspirational, communicate effectively, but lead. That is in the shortest supply, considering the surveys that we do. And that's a great message for people on this call. I think there is real demand for what you bring to the party. So I'd encourage everyone to do that. Not necessarily Monday, just every day of the week.
That's great. Well, that is a fantastic summing up. So we've got 4 great leadership tips: mind shift towards purpose, talent and diversity at the forefront. Partnerships, number one, but lead every day and be brave. Thank you to my fantastic panel. I've really enjoyed this session. I think your insights have been fantastic. So back to Emma.
Jenny and all our panellists, thank you so much. I'm sure our audience has really enjoyed it too. Jenny, thank you so much for all of that. And the mention of strategic partnerships there will be a specific panel looking at that just before the lunch break. So stay tuned in for that. Fantastic, detailed and useful insights from the panel there, as always. And if you're now feeling worried that there's been so much content already this morning that you're afraid you've missed something, then don't fear, because all the sessions will be made available on demand on the platform, and you'll have access to that until the 23rd of October. But for now, though, enjoy our relaxation break.